When you play music, your brain is doing 1,000 things at once. There's so many things to think about. And so as a composer or as a musician who's writing music down, you need to make it as easy for the performer as possible to get it right the first time. A lot of that comes down to the rhythms and how we choose to write them. There are multiple ways to write just about any rhythm that you can think of. Take these two rhythms, for example. If you were to play them, they would sound exactly the same, but they don't look the same. So which one is better? Which one would be easier for the performer to read? To answer that question, we need to think about how our brains interpret music. How do we hear those beats? How do we hear measures? And how do our brains organize all of this stuff? So the underlying structure of any music is the beat, or the pulse. And our brain takes that beat and organizes it into strong beats and weak beats, and then into groups, and those groups become measures. Music notation is really just taking what we hear, what we feel, and then turning it into something visual. The best way to notate music then is to take what we hear and try and make the visual representation match as closely as possible. That means we need to see the beats that we're hearing and feeling. Okay, so how do we do that? Let's go back to those two examples I showed you earlier. In this example, we're in a 4/4 time signature, which means that when we listen to the music, we can hear the underlying beat grouped into fours. And within those 4 beats, there are strong beats on 1 and 3 and weaker beats on 2 and 4. For the most part, we don't need to worry so much about notating the strong and weak beats, but we do need to make sure that the beats are clear in the music. We do that by barring the notes together to make the beats visible. In this case, we want to be able to see the quarter note beats. So any note values smaller than a quarter note are going to get beamed or barred together into quarter note equivalents. 2/8 notes, for example, are equivalent to 1 quarter note, so we bar them together, but only if they match up with the underlying pulse. If I had 2/8 notes here in the middle of the measure like this, I would not beam them together because that would not line up with the underlying pulse. Sometimes you have 2 options that could both work, and you have to make a decision which one of these options is going to be cleaner and clearer for the musician to read and perform. For example, say I wanted to write a rhythm that sounded like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 2 options for that. I could write it as a dotted quarter note, 2 16th notes, and then a half note. Or I could write it as a quarter note tied to an 1/8 note, and then 2 16th notes followed by a half note. There are actually a lot of other options too, but we're going to keep it simple and just focus on these 2. Both options could be correct. Both options are going to result in the same rhythm when you perform them correctly. Now, if you were to ask me, I would say the second option is probably our better option. Why? Because you can clearly see where those 16th notes land. You can see that it's on the second half of the second beat. With the dotted quarter note, yeah, that does mean the same thing, but it's not as clear to see. So if you have an inexperienced musician trying to play this, it's going to be more likely that they're going to mess it up. I teach a lot of beginning and intermediate students, and I can tell you from experience, dotted 1/8 notes are much more likely to mess them up than ties. Ties make it easier to see where the beat is and easier to count and play it correctly. You also need to remember that depending on your time signature, it's not always the quarter note that gets the beat. If we're in 2/2 time, for example, the half note gets the beat, not the quarter note. All of the same rules apply, but now we're grouping things into the half note equivalent instead of the quarter note equivalent. So if I have 4/8 notes, I'm not going to group them in 2s like I would with a 4/4 time signature. I'm going to group them all together in a group of 4. It also gets a little more complicated when we get into 6/8 or other types of compound time signatures. For these time signatures, the quarter note does not get the beat, and it's not the half note. It's not any even number of 1/8 notes that we're grouping together. In 6/8, it's actually the dotted quarter note that gets the beat. We're grouping 3/8 notes together into 1 beat. That's right, we're grouping 3/8 notes together. So instead of having groups of 2 or groups of 4, we have 3s. And if you have 16th notes in that grouping, you're still going with the equivalent of a dotted quarter note, or 3/8 notes. So if you have a rhythm that straddles beats or straddles the pulse that you hear and feel in the music, a lot of times it's better to use ties rather than a full note value. So for example, in 3/4 and 6/8, we technically have the same number of eighth notes, and we can do all the same rhythms between those two different time signatures, but we don't really want to notate them the same way. So in 3/4, it's totally okay to write 3/4 notes. That's perfectly fine. In fact, we want that because that is the main beat. That's the pulse that we feel. If you wanted to do that same rhythm in 6/8, however, it would be better to write a quarter note than 2 eighth notes tied together and then another quarter note. So in 6/8, we technically have 2 big beats in the measure, and they're both worth dotted quarter notes. By putting 2 eighth notes in the middle and tying them together, we show where that beat separation is, and it actually becomes easier to count and play correctly. Okay, but what if you're in an asymmetrical or an irregular meter like 7/8? What is the beat there? What the heck are we gonna do? How are we gonna bar these notes? Well, even in an irregular meter like 7/8, you still have an underlying pulse. And 7/8 is a great example. In 7/8, typically you're gonna feel it in groups of 2s and 3s. So you're gonna feel something like this: 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, or it might be 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, or it could even be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. That 7/8 can be a really fun time signature to work with, but it can also be really confusing if we're constantly changing. Even if we're not changing, we still want the music to line up with what you hear and feel. That's going to make it a lot easier for the performer to play correctly. Bar the notes in a way that you can see the groupings. Where are the 2s? Where are the 3s? Put them in so they're easily visible. So now that we know how to take care of the rhythm, what about pitches? How do we make pitches easier for musicians to read? I've got another video for you. You can check it out right over there. It's all about enharmonic pitches and why it makes music easier to read. And if you're interested in more in the difference between simple and compound meters and how to write and notate all of that, that would be over there. We'll see you later.